Hello, and welcome back to our channel. If you enjoy emotional, powerful stories about life, love, and redemption, you're in the right place. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment that might touch your heart. Now sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. Henry Whitmore sat by the window of his study, the soft afternoon light casting long shadows across his silver hair and deeply lined face. At 75 years old, he remained the head of Whitmore Enterprises, a real estate empire stretching from Pennsylvania to New York. But today, he wasn't poring over market reports or investment portfolios. In his hands, he held a faded photograph, yellowed with age. In the picture was a stunning woman with chestnut waves, wearing an ivory wedding dress, standing beside a young man in a sharp black tuxedo. It was the day of his wedding to Evelyn, the woman who had been by his side for over 4 decades, yet had never once looked at him with love. The Whitmore estate in the outskirts of Harrisburg was a wedding gift to Evelyn, a white colonial house with a blue-painted picket fence, a garden of lavender blooms, and a quiet pond tucked behind. Henry had poured his heart into creating a dream home for the woman he adored. But from the very first day, Evelyn had lived there as a stranger. Polite, distant, cold. He recalled their wedding night vividly. After the guests had left, the soft light from their bedroom lamps flickered over the vintage mirror. As he approached her, heart thudding like a schoolboy's, Evelyn turned away and whispered, "I'm tired," not out of fear, but because her heart already belonged to someone else. And he, Henry, the successful, respected man, was merely a substitute. Henry wasn't naive. Within a month of their wedding, he sensed something was off. Evelyn was pregnant, but the dates didn't line up. He had waited until their wedding night to be intimate with her. Yet their daughter, Annabelle, was born barely 7 months later. The doctors called it a premature birth, but Henry's instincts, honed from years in business, told him otherwise. At that moment, he stood at a crossroads. Confront Evelyn and tear everything apart, or remain silent and accept reality. Henry chose the latter. He had fallen for Evelyn the moment he saw her at a charity gala in New York. She had walked in wearing a deep blue velvet gown, her eyes sharp, her presence magnetic. Evelyn was unlike any woman he'd met before. Not sweet, not gentle, but captivating. He courted her for nearly a year. When she finally said yes, he thought he was the luckiest man alive. Only later did he understand her yes had nothing to do with love. It was an escape from a heartbreaking relationship with a struggling musician named Michael, and from the judgmental eyes of a high-society family expecting perfection. Annabelle grew up in his arms like the granddaughter he'd never had. Henry never brought up the truth, not once. He took her to school, sat through her dentist appointments, taught her to behave like a lady and how to play piano. When she turned 10, Evelyn remarked coldly, "Are you trying to compensate for something?" He only smiled and replied, "I'm not compensating. I just love her. That's all." But his love for both Evelyn and Annabelle was like water poured into sand. Evelyn remained aloof. By their 3rd year of marriage, they had separate bedrooms. Their dinners were always impeccably prepared, the tables set with candles, wine, and flowers. But what was missing was warmth. Their friends and the media praised the Whitmores as the ideal couple. No one knew that beneath the surface, they were 2 strangers passing in the hallway. Other men in Henry's position would have chosen another path: affairs, secret flings, or even divorce to seek happiness. But Henry wasn't one of them. He was the kind of man who, when he loved, loved to the end, even if that love was never returned. He remembered one winter when Evelyn fell seriously ill. She was hospitalized for a week. He canceled every meeting, slept on the hospital couch, and nursed her himself. When she finally regained consciousness, the first thing she said was, You didn't have to do this. I'm fine. No thank you. No handhold. Just that." Still, he never stopped trying. For over 40 years, Henry gave her peonies on every birthday, wrote her handwritten letters on their anniversary, accompanied her to every event like a silent shadow. He kept hoping, year after year, that maybe, just maybe, she would finally see him. But that day never came. Now, with white hair and fading strength, Henry realized he was living the last years of his life alone. The grand estate was silent. Only the wind echoed down the long corridors, and the chimes tapped gently against the glass windows. Evelyn was hardly ever home anymore, partly due to her writing career, partly because she didn't want to be. Whenever she returned, she barely stepped into the living room, had a quiet dinner with Annabelle, then retreated early to bed. Once, Henry tried writing her a letter. In it, he admitted he had known everything since the beginning, even that the child wasn't his. But he tore it up. He knew Evelyn didn't want those words, and he didn't want to turn his love into a transaction. He loved. That was enough. No conditions. No demands. In the golden light of dusk, he whispered, "Evelyn, you were never really mine, but I'm grateful you stayed, even as a shadow." Then he gently placed the wedding photo on the polished oak desk, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes, slipping into a dream where, just once, Evelyn would smile at him the way he always wished she would. Autumn in Boston carried a gentle chill and the earthy scent of fallen leaves swirling around every street corner. Evelyn Whitmore walked slowly through the crowd, a cup of steaming cappuccino in her hand. She was 70 years old now, but her face retained its elegance, deep-set eyes, a proud chin, and a quiet nobility that hadn't faded with age. She had come to the city with her daughter Annabelle to attend an art exhibition, one where Annabelle had been invited as an honored guest. Evelyn wasn't particularly excited, but she didn't decline. She had long grown used to accompanying her daughter to such events, not out of deep maternal love, but because it was simply part of the role she had maintained for decades. They had just stepped out of the gallery when a light rain began to fall. Annabelle rushed into a nearby bookstore, but Evelyn lingered under the awning of an old cafe. And then she saw him. The man across the street, holding an umbrella, was helping an elderly woman cross the road. The golden streetlight illuminated the streaks of gray in his hair, but she recognized him instantly, without a sliver of doubt. Michael, the man she had once loved, the man she had nearly given everything up for. How many years had passed? 40? Or even more? The last time she had seen him was at Grand Central Station, when she had swallowed her tears and turned away, stepping onto a train bound for Harrisburg, leaving behind an unfinished promise and a love unspoken. Michael hadn't noticed her at first. He was chatting with a barista, but when he looked up, his eyes met hers, and it was like a wave crashing onto shore. They both froze for a few seconds, rain still misting down between them. Evelyn wanted to turn away, but her feet remained planted. Michael's gaze hadn't changed. It was still gentle, still the same look that once made her feel seen, understood, and loved without question. They didn't speak. They only looked at each other. Then Michael gave a small nod. Evelyn returned it. It lasted only seconds, but her heart tumbled like a sheet of music with no melody. When Annabelle returned to fetch her, she quickly turned her face away and walked as if nothing had happened. But inside, the past surged like a dam breaking after years of silence. That night, Evelyn stood on the hotel balcony, gazing down at the glowing streets. She held a glass of wine, but didn't drink. Her mind was filled with images of Michael, the young man who once lived off a guitar and handwritten songs, yet could make her laugh all afternoon with just one line. They had once dreamed of a wooden cabin in Vermont, lavender fields, a dog, an afternoon spent composing by the window. It all sounded like a fairy tale now, but it had once been real. Memories flooded back, out of order. Afternoons in the park, reading poetry to each other, nervous hand-holding, afraid of being seen. And that final night, when she told him she was pregnant. Michael had held her close and promised they'd face it together. But Evelyn couldn't do it. She didn't have the courage. She feared poverty, her mother's judgment, society's expectations, and, most of all, herself. 3 weeks later, Evelyn received an unmarked envelope at home. The handwriting was familiar. "I don't believe in fate. But if I were to see you again, even just for a minute, I would know who my heart once beat for." It wasn't a long letter, but she read it dozens of times. She never replied. Yet after that, other signs began to appear. A a small painting mailed to Annabelle with a note that read, "A gift from an old friend of your mother's." A vintage vinyl record left mysteriously on her desk. A bundle of dried lavender placed by her front door, the scent she had once called the fragrance of lost dreams. At first, she was angry. She believed Michael was trying to disrupt the fragile peace she had spent a lifetime building. But soon, Evelyn began to lie awake at night, wondering, was it really peace? Or just a mask she had forced herself to wear over the emptiness inside? Henry didn't say anything when he noticed the lavender bouquet on the dining table. He simply placed it in a crystal vase, poured her a cup of Earl Grey tea, and said softly, "You've been smiling more lately. I'm glad." Evelyn didn't know whether to thank him or apologize. The next day, she received another letter. This time, it was signed Michael R. Jennings. He wrote, "Evelyn, I don't expect you to come back. I just want you to know there's someone out here who still carries every part of you once left behind. If you want, I'll be at the little cafe on Beacon Street this Friday. If you don't come, I'll understand. And you'll never hear from me again." Friday arrived. Evelyn stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She didn't dress up, just a beige sweater, a gray skirt, and simple flats. But her hair was brushed carefully, and her lips bore a soft pink hue. She left the hotel without her phone. At the cafe, she spotted him near the window, reading an old book. When she entered, Michael looked up, and his eyes lit up, just like they had on that rainy afternoon. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Evelyn sat down. Both of them smiled, the first true smile in over 40 years. And in that moment, Evelyn no longer felt like Mrs. Whitmore. She was simply Evelyn, a woman who had once loved, once lost, and now sat beside a memory that still lived and breathed. Some memories, no matter how much time passes, remain like rusted blades lodged deep in the heart, aching quietly, refusing to fade. Evelyn had believed she had buried that past in the farthest corners of her mind. But the moment she stood face to face with Michael, the moment her heart dared to flutter again under a familiar gaze, that pain surged back, sharp and suffocating. Many had wondered why Evelyn Whitmore, once the object of countless desires, remained so cold to a husband who had everything: wealth, prestige, and patience. But they didn't know that behind her elegant mask, Evelyn had died once. At the age of 26, the day she lost her second child in a blood-soaked, silent miscarriage. Annabelle was only 3 then, the only true comfort Evelyn had. Though not Henry's biological child, he never treated her differently. He cared for her attentively, read her bedtime stories, took her to the park on weekends. Sometimes, Evelyn would quietly watch them from a distance, her heart torn between gratitude and suspicion. It was a time when she was still trying to open her heart, to forget Michael, to live fully in the role of a wife. But all of that came crashing down on a cold winter night. That evening, Henry came home late, reeking of alcohol, his eyes bloodshot, steps unsteady. Evelyn was reading in the living room when she heard the front door slam. She stood up and gently asked, "Did you drink too much tonight?" But instead of replying, he stared at her, his gaze strange, clouded, one she had never seen on the usually composed, restrained man she called husband. Suddenly, he reached for her hand. Evelyn recoiled. "Henry, you're drunk. You should rest," she said, trying to stay calm. But he didn't let go. What happened next became a nightmare Evelyn never wanted to recall, but one she could never forget. In his drunken haze, Henry forced himself on her, his own wife, the woman he claimed to love with all his heart. The next morning, when he sobered, Henry barely remembered what had happened. Evelyn sat silently in the corner of the bed, arms wrapped around her trembling body. He asked, "Did something happen last night?" She simply shook her head. "No tears, no screams." But from that day on, something in Evelyn's soul shut down. A few weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. The news struck like a second blow. Evelyn couldn't touch her belly without feeling sick. She tried to eat, tried to stay healthy, but her body weakened each day. She didn't want to bring into the world a child born from violation, a living reminder of a night she wished she could erase. As the 6th month approached, her health deteriorated. She told no one about her condition. Henry believed she was just tired. Only the housekeeper, Helen, noticed something was wrong. "You barely eat a thing. You look so pale. Is everything all right?" Evelyn only smiled faintly. "I'm fine." Then one night, thunder roared outside as Evelyn clutched her abdomen in unbearable pain. Blood soaked the sheets. Helen panicked and called an ambulance, but by the time they reached the hospital, it was too late. The baby was born in silence, never crying, never breathing. The doctor lowered his head and said, "I'm sorry, and I must inform you, you won't be able to have children again." Evelyn said nothing. She stared out the hospital window where bare trees trembled in the storm. Something inside her died that night, forever. Henry arrived hours later, full of worry. When he learned that the baby had not survived and that Evelyn would never conceive again, he was devastated. He took her hand, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would come to this." Evelyn pulled her hand away. Her voice was ice cold. "No, you didn't know, and you never will." From that moment on, she never looked at him as a husband again. Whenever he spoke, she responded with curt civility. The Whitmore estate, from then on, became nothing more than a shell, grand, flawless, but hollow to the core. Henry tried to make amends. He took her on retreats, bought her jewelry, hired therapists. But Evelyn didn't want any of it. She needed a forgiveness her heart could not offer. Every time she walked past the room that was meant to be the nursery, Evelyn's chest tightened. She never told Annabelle the truth. All she said was, "Love your body and never let anyone touch you if you don't want them to." Annabelle, still too young to understand, remembered those words all her life. And from that point on, Evelyn lived like a ghost in her own story. She still attended parties and charity galas, still stood beside Henry as the picture-perfect wife. But inside, she was a woman who had lost her ability to trust, in love, in marriage, in the man who had once vowed to protect her. She smiled, but only with her lips. She lived, but merely existed, until she saw Michael again. Evelyn sat alone in the small library of the Harrisburg house, a quiet corner she often retreated to in the afternoons when her mind grew too noisy. Sunlight poured across the old wooden floors, casting a soft golden hue across the room. But her thoughts were in turmoil, like a storm gathering just beneath her skin. She had returned from Boston 3 days ago, and though she had tried to push Michael's gentle gaze from her mind, his invitation to meet at the little cafe on Beacon Street still echoed like distant music she couldn't turn off. That meeting, she hadn't responded. She hesitated. Within Evelyn was a constant tug-of-war between duty and desire, between all she had lost and everything she had tried to preserve. Henry had once given her security, respect, a quiet life. But could gratitude ever truly replace a heart that had long since gone hollow? She wasn't sure. Trying to distract herself, Evelyn rose from her chair and walked to the far bookshelf pressed against the wall, a place where she kept her oldest books, drafts from her student days, and old keepsakes rarely touched. She reached for a weathered Edith Wharton novel she used to adore. As she pulled the book from the shelf, something slipped out and fell to the floor. A letter. It was old, the paper yellowed with age, the envelope unsealed and untitled. Evelyn bent down to pick it up, a chill creeping across her skin. She opened it, and her eyes stopped at the very first line. Hotel invoice. The Rittenhouse Hotel, Room 604, Philadelphia, March 16th, 2014. Attached was a dinner receipt for two at the hotel's Italian restaurant. The names were clear, Mr. Henry Whitmore and Miss Celia Harper. Celia Harper? Evelyn had never heard that name at any social event with Henry. She wasn't on a list of staff or known associates. A strange name, yet vaguely familiar, like something she'd once overheard in a passing phone call outside his office door. Her hands began to tremble. Her heart thudded against her ribcage. The sensation was nauseating, eerily similar to the day she discovered her second pregnancy, the one that ended in unbearable loss. A wound she thought had scarred over was now bleeding again. She sank into the armchair, clutching the invoice like a shard of truth she never asked for. Evelyn was not a jealous woman. She had grown used to distance, to a marriage without love. But what she could never accept was betrayal. "You didn't have to love me," she whispered, "but you had no right to betray my silence." She recalled the many nights Henry had come home late, offering vague excuses, a sudden meeting, a dinner with partners, or traffic from Philadelphia. Each time, she simply nodded, poured him tea, and sat across from him as if all was normal. She never asked questions. She had thought, perhaps foolishly, that there was nothing left between them worth betraying. But she had been wrong. Who was Celia Harper? A secret mistress? An old flame? A passing distraction? Evelyn didn't need the details. The very fact that Henry had spent a weekend with another woman, while she preserved the last shreds of her dignity, was a knife to the pride she had spent decades holding together. She stepped onto the balcony. The wind swept through her hair, but her chest felt heavy as stone. In the distance was the lavender garden Henry once planted for her. Evelyn stared at the rows of soft purple, and for the first time, they seemed scentless. Perhaps they had always been. Perhaps she had only imagined it. That night, Evelyn dined alone. Henry called, saying he'd be late. A meeting ran longer than expected. She didn't respond. She simply ended the call. After nightfall, she returned to her writing desk and pulled out the letter Michael had sent, the one she had never opened but had always kept. Her fingers shook as she opened the envelope. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means you still have the courage to face yourself, whether you come or not. All I ask is that you live by your own heart. Not for anyone else. Not even for me. Just for you." She laid the letter beside the hotel invoice. Evelyn's heart ached. Not for Michael, not entirely for Henry, but for herself. For the woman who had lived more than half her life in a golden cage, believing she had grown used to the dark, only to find a sliver of light slipping through the cracks. That night, for the first time in many years, Evelyn turned on the heater, wrapped herself in a shawl, and opened her journal. The first line she wrote was simple. "I'm still alive, and I'm beginning to feel it." That afternoon, Evelyn left the house without telling anyone. She simply placed a handwritten note on the dining table. "Don't wait for dinner." No signature, no explanation. When Henry returned home around 7 p.m., the house was silent as always, but this time, an odd sense of unease crept in. He read the note, set it down, and quietly sat in the armchair near the fireplace, watching the flames flicker. He didn't know that at that very moment, Evelyn was on a train heading for Boston. She carried only a small leather handbag, with her journal, a scarf, and Michael's letter inside. Outside, the wind picked up. Trees along the tracks swayed as golden leaves drifted down like pieces of memory. Evelyn wondered if Michael would still be waiting. The letter had been sent over a week ago. Maybe he had moved on. Maybe he understood she didn't have the courage. But if he was still there, the cafe on Beacon Street hadn't changed. It still had large windows, dark wooden tables, and the scent of roasted coffee lingering in the air. Evelyn pushed the door open, her heart pounding so fast she felt like a young girl lost at her first love. She looked around, and then she saw him. Michael was sitting by the window, just like before, a book in hand, hair grayer than she remembered. But his eyes, those eyes hadn't changed. When he saw her, he stood and gave a slight bow like a gentleman. No surprise, no rush, as if he had always believed she would come. Evelyn sat down. They looked at each other. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke, as if language was too heavy for a moment this fragile. Michael broke the silence first. "You're still as beautiful as the last time I saw you." Evelyn smiled softly, like an exhale. "And you're still the only person who could make me take a train without knowing where it would lead." They both laughed, not with awkwardness or regret, but like two people who had aged with the knowledge of what they'd lost, yet found peace in simply sitting together again. Michael shared that he had left the commercial music industry long ago. He now lived in a small seaside town in Maine, teaching music to children with disabilities. Evelyn told him she still wrote, not books, but entries in her journal, for herself. They spoke of things they had lost, years that had drifted away, and the loneliness no one else had ever seen. When their coffee had gone cold, Michael leaned in slightly and asked, "Do you regret it?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment before answering, "Yes, but not for choosing to leave you. I regret staying somewhere I didn't belong for far too long." A breeze stirred the curtains slightly. Michael looked at her for a long time, voice low. "I used to be angry with you. For a very long time. But now I just want you to live, truly live. Whether that's with me or not." Evelyn met his gaze. And for the first time in over 40 years, she said something she had never admitted to anyone. "That night, I was pregnant. The child was yours." Michael froze. "But I lost the baby because someone else took away my right to be a mother, and with it, the last bit of trust one had left." He reached for her hand and gently held it. He didn't ask anything more. They sat in silence. It was enough. That night, Evelyn didn't return to Harrisburg. She rented a small room in a nearby hotel and left the window open to let the wind in. On the desk lay her journal, open to a blank page. She began to write, "I don't hate the man who was once my husband, but I can no longer love him either, because he's the one who took away a part of who I am." The next morning, Evelyn returned to the train station. In her hand was a small box containing Michael's letter and the hotel invoice that proved Henry had once spent the weekend with a woman named Celia Harper. She didn't burn it, didn't tear it up. She kept it as a final reminder that if you can still feel pain, it means you're still alive. When she arrived home, Henry was sitting in the library, his face weary, eyes full of worry. He looked at her like he wanted to say so many things, but didn't know where to begin. Evelyn placed the small box on the table without a word. Then she looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't need an apology. I just need to know, are you still a man capable of regret?" Henry froze. His face went pale. He opened the lid of the box and saw the two items inside. And he understood. There were no justifications. No more excuses. Only truth, raw and far too late. After that brief exchange, the atmosphere inside the Whitmore house turned into a muted gray. Something intangible but heavy. Evelyn no longer voiced her anger, but Henry knew her silence carried more weight than any accusation could. He didn't ask when she had found out, nor did he try to explain. Whenever he passed the library, where the small box still sat on the table, he would lower his head, as if the guilt itself had taken physical form and settled on his shoulders. Evelyn, on the other hand, began to feel lighter. Not because she had forgiven, but because after more than 40 years, she had finally dared to speak her pain aloud. She had taken a step away from her lifelong role as the compliant wife and stood face to face with the man she once loved in the wrong way. A few days later, it began to rain softly. Evelyn sat by the window, a cup of steaming chamomile tea in her hands. She turned to the last page of her journal, the one where she wrote about the night she saw Michael again. Though she hadn't spoken of it, Henry seemed to understand. Since then, he had grown unusually quiet. He no longer stayed out late for endless meetings. He stayed home, in the same space as her, but kept the respectful distance she had drawn long ago. One morning, as Evelyn walked into the kitchen, she saw Henry fumbling with a French press coffee maker, something he had never touched before. He looked clumsy, but genuine. When he saw her, he spoke softly. "You still like French-style coffee, right?" Evelyn raised her brows slightly. It had been so long since Henry called her you with such gentle familiarity. Not Evelyn, not Mrs. Whitmore, but something simpler, softer, like a faint echo from the past. She didn't reply, just sat down by the window, gazing at the raindrops clinging to the glass. A few moments later, Henry placed a cup of hot coffee in front of her, black, no sugar, no milk, exactly how she had liked it when she was young. Evelyn lifted the cup, blew gently, took a sip. The warmth trickled down her throat, then to her chest. She said nothing, but her hand beside the cup no longer clenched the way it used to. Henry looked at her, his voice hoarse. "I used to think just keeping you beside me was enough. But I didn't understand that keeping someone locked inside a shell isn't love. I was wrong a long time ago." Evelyn didn't respond, but her eyes no longer held that icy sharpness, nor tears. The following days passed quietly. They lived in the same house like two parallel lives, but no longer like strangers. On certain afternoons, when Evelyn was reading in the library, Henry would knock gently and sit in the chair beside her without saying a word. Just sitting, like someone asking for permission to be present, without expectation. One day, Evelyn asked, "Did you love that woman?" Henry looked her straight in the eyes, not flinching. "No, she was just an escape. When I realized I'd hurt you beyond repair and couldn't turn back time, I let myself give up, and I was the one left behind to carry the consequences. No, you were the one I always loved, but it was a weak love. Selfish. A love that didn't know how to love properly." Evelyn nodded, as if to place a final period on that chapter. A week later, Michael called. She picked up. His voice was still deep, still gentle, like the day they met again in the cafe. "I'm not calling to ask what you've decided. I just want to know, are you okay?" Evelyn paused for a few seconds, then softly said, "I'm still learning how to breathe like a real person." "Then, that's good," he replied. Before hanging up, Michael added, "My door in Maine is always open. Not to hold you back, but so you'll know. If one day you need a place without a past, I'll be there." Evelyn didn't respond. But that night, she went out to the garden and picked the season's first lavender. That scent, once only a memory, had become part of her present. She placed a small bundle on Henry's desk without a note. But Henry understood. The next day, he went to a used bookstore and found a first-edition Edith Wharton novel, one of her favorites, and placed it on her table. No explanation, but Evelyn understood. And just like that, the door between their souls no longer remained locked. It opened, not to return to what once was, but to step into the light. September arrived with a gentler wind, clearer, quieter, and full of thought. Leaves began to fall along the path beside the lavender garden, each one drifting down like a whisper from time itself. Evelyn could feel her body slowing with the season, not from age alone, but from acceptance. A deep calm that came only after surviving many storms. One peaceful afternoon, as she was watering the plants, a car pulled up in front of the estate. A young man stepped out, tall, composed, with a youthful face and eyes that held more life than his years. He wore a simple white shirt, polite but unpretentious. Evelyn noticed him from afar. Surprised, yes, but something in her urged her to stay silent and observe. Henry was the first to meet him at the gate. He recognized the face the moment the young man spoke. "My name is Julian. I believe you might be my father." Henry froze. The autumn breeze brushed gently past, and in that moment, time itself seemed to pause. Julian pulled a letter from his pocket, handwritten by a woman Henry had tried to forget, Celia Harper. She had passed away 3 months earlier from cancer. In her final days, Celia had told Julian the truth she had withheld for decades. Enclosed with the letter was an old photograph of her and Henry together, along with a single line. "This was the man who once loved me most." Julian didn't come demanding anything. He wasn't there for a confrontation or inheritance. He simply wanted to know who his father was, to see him, to touch a piece of a hidden past. Evelyn sat quietly in the living room, listening to the conversation between two men, one young, one old, without saying a word. And strangely, she didn't feel angry. She felt that everything had come full circle. Henry, the man who had taken away her right to be a mother, now had a child of his own, a child she had never born, never held. And now, while Evelyn had learned how to live alone, Henry had begun to feel what it was to be filled by blood, by lineage. She didn't feel pain, or bitterness, or sorrow, just a calm acceptance as Julian bowed politely before he left, his voice honest and soft. "I know this might be difficult for you, but I didn't come to take anything. I only wanted to know. And thank you for listening." Evelyn smiled and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. There are things in life that belong to no one. But if you've had the courage to seek the truth, you deserve to be respected. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat in the library, flipping through the last pages of her journal. Her handwriting no longer trembled. The lines were steady, clear, like someone who finally knew what she wanted. The next morning, under the golden autumn light, Evelyn poured Henry a cup of tea. He looked at her, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes, like a man waiting for a conversation he knew he couldn't avoid. But Evelyn only said calmly, "I want a divorce." Henry set the teacup down slowly. Not a shock, but because he had known this moment would come. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm not resentful. I just want to live the rest of my life as myself. Not for anyone, not for any reason. I think that's enough." Henry was quiet for a long time. He nodded, eyes drifting toward the garden. "I understand, and I respect that." Evelyn stood, smoothing her dress. "I don't want anything from the settlement. I don't need anything but my freedom. What we had, even with the pain, even with the failures, was enough to close the book." "And Julian?" Henry asked softly, like a voice echoing in a hallway. "Take care of him. If you can be the father you never got to be before." Evelyn stepped onto the porch, looking out over the clear autumn sky. Inside her, there was nothing left to release. No expectations, no waiting, only peace. 2 months later, Evelyn moved to a small cottage along the Delaware coast, where she could hear the waves each morning, smell the sea salt in the air, and replant old lavender beds. She kept writing. She meditated. She stayed in touch with Annabelle and occasionally met with Michael, like two old friends walking side by side without needing to define what they were. The life of Evelyn Whitmore, the woman who once lived like a shadow, had finally closed a long chapter. Not with slammed doors, but with a quiet step away from the place she once thought was home. And that autumn, she learned how to breathe again, not for anyone else, but finally for herself.